Darth Plagueis was a dark lord of the Sith, so powerful and so wise, he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life.
Let the Force guide. I will.
What my work explored was the hopes of combining multiple strands to create replicas that incorporated the best genetic attributes of both donors.
A power like life itself.
What's up, MetaNerdz? Of course, spoilers for the Mando finale, so if you want, back out now, but let's jump into it. What we saw with Moff Gideon is the result of Strand-Casting, and it was the tech Palpatine used to create both Snoke and his final body. It was how he got around the age-old problem of cloning Force sensitives. This was something neither the Kaminoans or his old master Darth Plagueis could figure out, the holy grail of cloning research. So we'll cover everything from Darth Tenebrous to the Sith Eternal, and everything in between. But first, let's thank this video's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. This game gets really addictive. I found myself developing a rivalry against this green witch. At first I couldn't make it past her weakest guards, but after some time and some upgraded armor and weapons, I was back in there and, well, she still wrecked me, so I went and raided this guy's castle and took his loot. She has an ability that restores her health, and it's because of all these unique abilities across different enemies in the campaign and dungeons, you'll quickly find yourself being sucked in. There are hundreds of champions across different species and factions, 80 million downloads worldwide, excellent graphics, and literally billions of different ways to customize and combine your heroes. You'll find yourself moving through the campaign, taking on dungeons for special loot, leveling up in the tavern, and trying your luck against real players from across the world in the PvE arena. New players can join the hunt for dragon eggs from April 14th to May 15th. Just download Raid Shadow Legends using the link below, copy your in-game player ID, and then head over to egghunt.plarium.com from April 14th to May 15th. Enter your player ID and then journey through the Flaming Portal to embark on an exciting AR adventure. So if you haven't joined by now, what are you waiting for? Now is the best time to start playing Raid. Use this QR code to get all kinds of cool new loot and a starter pack. Once you're in and crushing those enemies, find me at MetaNerdz. Join my clan and we'll become legends together. So just hit that link down in the description and I'll see you on the battlefield. When Plagueis was looking into building a secret clone army, he started meeting with cloners around the 50s BBY, 30 years before the Clone Wars. And he went through a bunch of different options for the ideal genetic template. One of the earliest was the Yanchori, one of the rare species that could negate the effects of Force attacks. The Sith figured that if he could train an overwhelming horde of these strong brutes that could take away the Jedi's key advantage, it would level the playing field as it were, but also really knock the Jedi off balance as they were so used to being able to rely on the Force in battle. The Yanchori warrior wouldn't just be even with the Jedi, but he'd have a greater advantage because he was used to fighting without Force powers. Long before the Sith had been revealed, he was secretly running experiments to test various hypotheses and identify weaknesses in the Jedi Order, orchestrating all sorts of chaos across the galaxy. And the Yanchori's natural Force negating trait did provide some early success, killing unsuspecting Jedi and striking fear into the Jedi High Council. But once aware of this trait, the Jedi were able to outmaneuver and outsmart these simple brutes. This was problematic on its own, and Plagueis realized that he would have to abandon this once he had a long talk with the top cloners on Kamino.
Can compliance be bred into them without affecting their violent tendencies?
Probably not without disturbing the basic personality matrix. Have you considered using a more acquiescent species?
Ni Timor asked. Which would you recommend?
One of the placid species. Ithorians, for example, or Kaamasi?
Damask shook his head. Neither species would suit my purposes. What about humans?
The Yanchori were too violent and unpredictable, and he realized that as simple as the human was, no fancy powers, tough armor, or deadly claws, Plagueis understood that to deliver the revenge of the Sith, he would have to be more creative. This was the start of a line of thinking that went from making a formal army to oppose the Jedi, to a subversive plot, having the Sith's clones be joined with the Jedi Order. They would need a massive war to drag the Order into their old role as generals, and have their attention focused on the obvious external enemy. The Kaminoans at this time had been the longest standing providers of clone tech. Everything from organs to horrific monsters made for beast fights in far-off illegal gladiator rings, and they did make some troops for small private armies. Nothing had been done on this scale, and the production of the Grand Army of the Republic pushed many innovations in this field, seeing a greater boost in this era than in all of clone history, with Plagueis continuing his own research in his secret cloning facilities, trying to unlock the mysteries of the midichlorians. Plagueis' master was a Bith, Darth Tenebrous, and he combined Sith teachings with Bith science, as his people had ran their entire society off of complex eugenic systems. He even used this eugenic system to get Plagueis' parents together. And at the end of the day, the main difference between the light and dark side is that the light offers you eternal life and pleasure in the afterlife, if you can use your life on this mortal plane to do good, and to let go and become one with the will of the Force. While the dark side is about using your will to get as much as you can out of life on this material plane, with the ultimate expression being to avoid physical death, to stay embodied in the mortal plane with a physical existence. Darth Tenebris's plan to achieve immortality was to use Bith science to create a retrovirus that would infect the midichlorians in his own cells, turning them into what he called maxichlorians, which were now slaved to his physical body. This did cut off his connection to the cosmic force, depriving him of the ability of precognition, but it also meant that they would not revert back to become one with the force after the death of the other normal cells in his body. He just needed to have a perfectly healthy body to inhabit forever. And that's what got Plagueis on this track, and ultimately something Sidious would master, using essence transfer to migrate into perfect bodies in perpetuity. But Tenebris would never master a way to get the maxichlorians into a new host, and his efforts were cut short by good old-fashioned Sith betrayal. Without the precognitive abilities, Plagueis was able to collapse a cave-in on his master, leading to an agonizing bodily death, but the maxichlorians survived trapped in the flesh, maintaining his consciousness and perhaps living on forever, as the midichlorians don't die but become one with the Force. It's what all that magical yellow gold plasma-like material is, going back to this living Force nexus. They are organic links to the metaphysical plane of consciousness.
Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force.
The last thing known about Tenebris is that he was stuck in a nightmarish, conscious hell that was experiencing the pain of his death in a constant loop. The maxichlorians unable to return and become one with the Force, there was no recycling or washing away of the memory of a previous life. It's possible he achieved immortality in the physical plane, the Sith dream proving to be a nightmare for him, and a fate that no one would envy. Microscopic cell bunches maintaining a hellish consciousness on the underside of a rock on a forgotten world. Plagueis was laser focused on finally cracking the mystery of the physical and metaphysical connection, developing a new theory that separated the Force into three categories: the Aperion, or unifying force, the Anima, or living force, and the Pneuma, or individual consciousness. He was so set on rejecting the mystical traditions of both Jedi and Sith orders that it's interesting that he doesn't acknowledge the cosmic force. Even some ancient Jedi beliefs broke the Force into parts like this, but almost all cultures thought that that fourth element was obvious, the mind of the Force itself. The idea that the Force has a will and goals of its own, something Plagueis seems to acknowledge at some times, while also being adamant that this is the ultimate goal of the Sith, to make themselves a god and reject the rule of some higher power.
The greater goal of the Sith involved toppling the Force itself and becoming the embodiment of the galaxy's animating principle. Only the Sith understood that sentient life was on the verge of a transformative leap, that through the manipulation of midichlorians, or the overthrow of the forceful group that supervised them, the divide between organic life and the Force could be bridged, and death could be erased from the continuum.
One of the longest running experiments was on a secret Bith apprentice of Tenebris, one that Plagueis had captured, exposing that his master had not been obeying the Darth Bane rule of two. And after an assassination attempt left Plagueis scarred and deformed, he went into a maddening overdrive to dominate the Force. He would summon his apprentice, Darth Sidious, to his lab to witness the manipulation of various creatures in the cloning vats, showing him that he could kill them and raise them from the dead by dominating the will of the midichlorians. But moments later, the Bith's organs began to fail, deteriorate, and he was dead for good. This was around the year 42 BBY, and he revealed to his apprentice that he believed it was time to perform a ritual unlike anything the Sith had ever tried before. He had demonstrated his mastery of the midichlorians, and together with his powerful apprentice, they would meditate deep into the dark side, reaching out to try and interact with the living Force inside the countless midichlorians across the galaxy, and draw on their power to create a Sith spawn. But after much time and effort, Plagueis could sense the Force retreating from him, and he knew that something had fundamentally changed. They had tipped the scales of the universe in the side of the dark, and he saw that all of his clone experiments were rapidly developing devastating diseases, and he was certain that the Force was trying to actively thwart the Sith's efforts to conquer it. This confirmed that the Force had a consciousness of its own, and implied that it was greater than he, that despite allowing the dark and light to exist, it clearly had a preference for the light. But he was too far gone at this point to turn back. he would spend the next 8 years in madness, unaware that in his efforts to create an evil being through science, darkness, and willpower, the Force had reacted by spawning the Chosen One, a being purely of its own will that would destroy the Sith for good. The Cosmic Force making a statement that the dark side cannot create, only manipulate and destroy.
There was no father.
Sidious would continue this research, however, being even more clever than his Muun master, and when he realized that Anakin Skywalker was sent by the Force to destroy him, in the ultimate insult to the Force, he wanted to prove that he could corrupt and dominate even the Force's incarnated savior, make the Chosen One of prophecy a pathetic tool of the Sith. But he also knew that the clock was ticking. He had to make sure to push the Kaminoans to focus on cracking the mystery of cloning Force sensitives. Sidious had mastered essence transfer, but needed viable bodies strong in the Force. Whenever you one-to-one clone a Force sensitive with normal means, the spawns would degenerate, more proof of the active will of the Force scuttling attempts to dominate it or prevent change, as the seemingly random distribution of Force powers made sure that no being could ever fully dominate reality. Legends say that there was some success with Starkiller, but only after countless failures, all of them living short, horrific lives, marked with intense insanity and organ failure. The real breakthrough came by essentially tricking the Force into allocating midichlorians to beings that weren't identical. I think this is what Omega is supposed to be, though I would also guess something didn't work, as she would have expressed Force powers by now. But she certainly was a part of this secret clone project. I have a whole video I want to make on how incredible this scene is with Dr. Pershing, but for this video, just appreciate that he is explaining this Strand-Casting breakthrough that would be used to create Snoke and keep Sidious alive, the tech that would be used to make the beings that destroyed the New Republic. He's explaining all that to the upper crust of the New Republic, and the very orchestra where Palpatine shared the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise.
He could even keep the ones he cared about from dying. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
What my work explored was the hopes of combining multiple strands to create replicas that incorporated the best genetic attributes of both donors.
Only to have the insufferable, aloof elites show no interest in his work.
The first casts rejected the formula almost immediately.
Hello, Doctor.
But
it must be wonderful now that you...
And we're lucky to have you, Dr. Pershing.
How are you finding the city?
This is why Grogu is so important, and it means that part of his DNA strands believed to be responsible for attracting midichlorians, the bridge between biology and Force powers, could be spliced into Gideon's DNA. At the very least, he could have been using the Strand-Casting tech to identify the active parts in Grogu's DNA, since he would be a living specimen that could respond to experimentation, and then finding the correlating parts in matching humans. But because these strands can be so minuscule, small percentage changes in a DNA making for extremely different results, despite how weird it is to say that the still unnamed, simply called Yoda species they are still technically humanoid. And so it isn't that crazy to think that Grogu's strands were cast together with Gideon's. Thinking himself incredibly intelligent and a cunning warrior, the only thing missing was that unfair advantage hoarded by the Jedi.
I was isolating the potential to wield the Force.
And even Din Djarin expressed concerns about Grogu being a clone.
I think it might be a strand cast.
I don't think it was engineered. I've worked in the gene farms. This one looks evolved, too ugly.
His history as a Jedi, and being 50 years old, prove that he is not a Strand-Cast clone. But just keep in mind as a side point that being ugly is actually the easiest way to tell a Force-sensitive clone. Or at least an incredibly powerful Darksider, as the countless Snoke versions looked worse than him, and Sidious was rapidly running through weak and dying versions of himself, constantly needing to feed on the living force of others like we see in this final battle, where he is still quite decrepit, even having 30 years of refining this tech, a whole spider mech suit and thousands of cultists praying in the dark side for him. It shows just how titanic an effort it was to deny the will of the Force itself. Finally, they are able to get a viable, Strand-Cast creation that was powerful in the Force, with the version of Snoke that we see leading the First Order. And though he's a unique individual, his own Pneuma, as Plagueis would say, Sidious made sure to dominate his mind and will, like he did by being a constant presence in the mind of Kylo.
I have been every voice
you have ever heard inside your head.
So this is a funny possibility, but the fact that Gideon's clones look so good, not freakishly deformed, I can think of 3 different reasons for this. Either they were not incredibly strong in the Force, just a weak affinity which would be still powerful when combined with the suit and Beskar armor, or they have no Force connection at all, and Gideon didn't realize just how devious the Force could be in trolling those with bad intentions. Plagueis, Sidious, Vader, even the top Kaminoans were all sure of their success till the very last moments where there was some catastrophic degeneration, as if to make for a dramatic warning, to make it obvious that some Force stepped in. Or the funniest would be if they actually were very strong, but in the light side of the Force. Snoke was deemed exceptionally strong on the dark side, and the cultist scientists of the Sith Eternal and Sidious believed this was proof that they were exerting their will. Obviously they wanted a powerful darksider, and that's what they created. But Gideon has no Force powers and does not appear to be working with any other powerful darksider. All they have are the Grogu strands, or the strands taken from captured Jedi. He wasn't performing spooky Sith chants over the vats, and even if he didn't get the strands from Grogu, the next most likely were that they were samples taken from Jedi survivors stored in Fortress Inquisitorius. Either way, the least likely thing is that he had strands from a powerful darksider. These Gideon clones most likely had Force abilities from the strands of trained Jedi. So if Gideon was right, and they were viable, and Force sensitive, Din may have flushed away a bunch of Grogu's half-brothers. Or at least powerful light side allies. How crazy would that be?
And you smothered them before they could draw their first breath.
But before you feel too bad, it's also incredibly likely that each of these clones was living in constant agonizing pain. That was true for all the strands that came before, and almost all of them that came after. Please comment below what you think of all those different options, which is the most likely. And just to end this by being a completionist, in case you're wondering, Palpatine's son was also a Strand-Cast, but did not have any Force connection. Instead of killing him, Papa Palpy hoped that since there was strong evidence that Force traits were inherited, if the Force was punishing this attempt to conquer it by neutering his lab-born son, perhaps if that son procreated naturally, the offspring would be a normal creation in the eyes of the Force, and hopefully have Grandpa's powerful connection. So he made sure to have his son tracked, and this is why they made such a desperate effort to hide Rey. If she had been captured and corrupted from infancy, with the full force of the Sith Eternal cultists, Sidious, and their technology, a combo worse even than Fortress Inquisitorius, Rey would have been nothing more than a puppet slave like Snoke was. So the effort to hide her worked, and allowed for the destruction of the Sith, finally delivering the revenge of the Force. Unless, of course, somehow Palpatine returns. I think this is all some of the most interesting lore from the new canon, and I love how it can mash up with a lot of stuff from Legends. Of course, let me know what you think down below. Hitting that like button is the best way to help me out. Share the video and subscribe to see more, but most important of all, remember, sometimes being Darth Nietzsche isn't all it's cracked up to be. And the Force will be with you. Always.